Nothing but
Watch for me and his
compliments.
Dr. Horton. How did Dr. Horton pop up on my box? Anybody know?
I mean, I know you guys are really tight and working together. The synergy's really there lately, but
I rebuke that sentiment.
Dr. Green, that is weird. I don't know what.
That's weird, right?
Yeah.
Wow.
I just had a meeting with Donna Cross that was even weirder. We'll talk about that in a good way.
Okay, here we go, you guys. This is the special finance committee meeting at 4:01 p.m. December 9th, 2020.
Thank you, Adila. And due to the governor's executive order suspending certain Open Meetings Act requirements in order to comply with the state of emergency, the District 65 Finance Committee will be conducting the virtual board meeting, here today and all other board meetings until such time as that order changes. Our loan discussion topic today is the D65 financial outlook. There's kind of want to go over the agenda that I just lost because there's too many tabs open, or the kind of a format for our discussion today, some goals. And I know that Raphael and Kathy have put together a little slide deck as a starter conversation for us. So can I go through the goals first, and then we'll jump into the slide deck, Raphael and Kathy?
Please.
Okay. So for today, a couple of goals are going to be to define our target. So as a board, we're tasked with being stewards of the taxpayer dollars and to make sure that we are maintaining fiscal sustainability of our programs for years to come. And so one of the things that I hope by the end of today, we have a clear number that we all can commonly accept as the definition of our structural deficit. And that is also the problem that we're trying to resolve through these budget conversations. So one of our goals is to have that number in hand, and hopefully we can either be shown the information that helps us understand how we get to this number, and or ask the questions that we have so that we all are assuredly understanding it. I think it's really important, not just for us as board members to understand it, but it's important for the administration to understand it, because we're asking for their input and recommendations for how to build efficiencies and or reductions where necessary. It's also important for the community to understand what this number is and how we got to this number, that we're not just pulling a number from the sky and saying we want to make these changes just because. So that's one of our goals. Another goal is to define the process. The process has, as laid out, some extensive communication opportunities with our stakeholder groups, including parents, including staff, including non-parents in the community, and maybe even students. And so we'll talk about what those are going to look like. And then we're going to have an opportunity to have some board ideation and question asking. And this will be a time when we as board members will get a chance to ask in this open forum some questions that we have about our budget, about our programs, some of which to get answers and some of which to give the administration an idea for what it is that we need to know to be informed decision makers at the time at which we're being asked to make a decision. And we'll talk about the timeline within the process as goal 2 in a little bit. Any questions about kind of the task for the meeting today? Awesome. So at the end, we should know what our target number is. At the end, we should have an idea for the process for communication and a timeline from here leading up until March or April. And our administrative partners that are on this call with us will probably have a healthy list of questions that they're going to run away with to help us develop an understanding for how this dynamic over $100 million budget lives and breathes to support children via our programs. Okay. So without further ado, Raphael, Kathy, we're going to jump into to your welcome set.
So we're going to have Dr. Horton lead up the presentation, please.
Yeah, so as Joey spoke about, Thank you for leading into the why. We know many organizations that are successful are built off the why, and we want to be sure that our why is clear in order for us to offer highly productive education for all of our students, and to also meet all students where they are while helping them to exceed, the standard norm of student achievement. We must make sure that our fiscal house is in order, and that our dollars are spent in the best way to reach students and have the least amount of impact on the classroom. So on December 2nd, there was a letter to the community regarding finances and upcoming special board meeting. This is our second one. Today, of course, would be on December 9th. Our special finance committee meeting is hosting today, and we're going to talk about our goals, and we have a number that we're targeting over the next 3 years, and we want to communicate our process of how we're going to lead to that work. Between December 14th and the 31st of December, we're going to release a thought exchange. It's a community feedback opportunity, and it is something that will be shared via email. So all stakeholders and parents, staff, community members will receive this link, and they will have an opportunity to share. There will be a question that we will propose around our budget reductions, and you'll get a chance to share your thoughts around that. You can put in one thought, you can put in 20. But these thoughts there's an algorithm that will then put these similar thoughts together, and then it will create an overall analysis of what the community and stakeholders really believe is important around our budget. And that, again, that question has not been created, but it will be created before the 14th of December. Then when we return on between January 4th and the 31st, we're going to have board cafes. Board members truly care and are passionate about making sure that we right size fit our finances for the vision and the goals that we're setting. And so in these cafes, the boards will have access to the thought exchange, the key ideas that came from the thought process, and then they will have discussions, rich discussions, no preconceived ideas, but just really come into the community to talk about what do they feel about the thoughts stimulated from the exchange. We'll have staff forums between January 4th through the 31st. What does staff forums mean? That means we're going to meet with different union groups and representatives to talk about our budget, to get some ideas from them as well. We know they are on the front line doing this work, and it's important that we hear from them. On January 31st, between January 31st and the 15th, we will have a community and staff survey. We will send a survey out to really probe and get deeper into what the community and our stakeholders are expecting. And I want to go back because it's not captured in this timeline. Myself, Raphael, with Dr. Green, along with Kathy, will be meeting with each cabinet member starting as early as next week. And we will dive into some discussions around what are some of the recommendations that they would like to bring to the table in their respective areas that we can then turn around and bring to the board and the community in those discussions. On February 9th, there's a board meeting. We will give financial projections, update on financial projections, I should say. On March 9th, FY22 budget reductions and efficiencies presented to the Finance Committee at the Finance Committee meeting. Why March 9th? We know that there are timelines and deadlines. If there are going to be elimination of positions, that we must meet certain deadlines. And so we want to be sure that we give enough room to communicate with our staff if we're making shifts in their respective areas. On March 22nd, deadline for RIF for licensed staff. We will talk more about that process with our staff as we get closer to that timeline. Between March and April 21st, approved efficiencies and reductions to be incorporated into the FY22 budget. And then by June 7th of 22, give a tentative budget presentation to the Board Finance Committee. It's a lot loaded in between now and the end of the beginning of June, but we have to do that work. We want to be sure, as we talk about budget reductions, it's never a good time to do it. There's been communications I've received from families asking about why now. Well, this has been on the radar for quite some time, and we spent quite a bit of money and dollars to survive and for us to do well during this pandemic. And so in order for us to come out of this and still being able to offer our students the best education possible, we have to make some decisions that are not easy, but are necessary. So fiscal conservatism is something that we want to live by. We want to focus on efficiencies first, right? Knowing that there are some savings that we can make in those areas. We want to preserve the district's investments in students' academic and social emotional growth. That is a priority for us, and there's no negotiating that priority. Use equity lens to reduce spending. We also know that as we take budget cuts, a lot of times when school districts do that, it can impact our most marginalized students the most. We want to be sure that we are being equitable in how we approach this work, and also that there's an equity outcome expected. Protect our most vulnerable and historically marginalized student groups, as I spoke of. And there's been a lot of evaluation of programs for their effectiveness and alignment with the district's instructional and strategic goals. So we know there's some evaluations that we've done, programs that are doing well, but there are also some programs, in all honesty and full transparency, that are not doing that well, and we have to make decisions. Preserve its educational model. District's goal, we must preserve our educational model, keep our budget cuts as far from instruction as possible, and understanding that can be perceived in multiple ways, but we want to be sure that students do not miss out on learning and the opportunity. Reduce strategic deficit and promote sustainable spending. Strengthen equity throughout the district's buildings as a priority. Preserve referendum reserves. These rainy days, as we can definitely say, this was a rainy year so far. Keep its promise to the District 65 community from the referendum that was passed in 2017, and create robust educational model that cultivates growth for all district students, and I mean all, and protect its instructional and social emotional investments.
Now, one of the things that we've seen over the last few years with the Every Child Succeed Act is to have a site-based expenditure process, whereby there's transparency as to how funds are spent by building per child. So we've been thinking one of the approaches that we can take to actually strengthen that, to also strengthen our financial picture, is to move towards what is called site-based expenditure spending. And it's sometimes also called student-based budgeting. What it does is it allows each of our students to be allocated money. So the decision of budgeting is made based on student need as opposed to being driven by staff. So one way of doing that is we look at allocating each of our students a minimal amount of money that we think will be necessary for them to get a solid education in the district. And in addition to that, we know there are differences in where our students are. For example, we have some of our students who are special needs students or diverse learners, if you will. We know it costs the district a little bit more money to educate them than it does kids who are not special needs students. So we'll actually allocate more money to those students. And then we also know we have English learners, and we know it's going to cost more money to educate them too. So we will also provide additional money for that. So the SBB the thinking behind the SBB is to provide autonomy to each of the building in being able to get the resources they need for their particular building, for the students in those buildings to be able to achieve the way they want. What it also does, it provides transparency. So folks in the community can know how much each of the students in the district is allocated based amount, in addition to folks who need additional resources to be able to achieve. As I mentioned earlier, special education students, English learners. And what it also does, it creates a resource of equity, because everyone would know what the base amount is for each student, and for students who need additional money, what that amount is. So that is the one approach that we are looking at to be able to harness our financial resources and do it in an efficient way by doing site-based spending, or what is called student-based spending. What the good thing about this is driven by what students need as opposed to what staff need. So the critical thing about that I want to point out is that If we do this, it gives us a better control about our financial sustainability, because the spending is then driven more by students instead of by adults. And we also will spend the money that is allocated to each of the students in alignment with district values and priority, instead of just things that pops up. So the important thing that I want to point out about site-based expenditure spending or student-based expenditure spending is geared towards making sure that students have the resources they need to be successful and to be able to achieve the goals that we know they are able to. Then I'm going to pass it on to Kathy to step on and talk about some of the graphs that we developed.
So we would like to share some numbers with you. By law, we are required to present information for prior fiscal year to EASB in September. We did that. There was a presentation, but in the spirit of transparency, this year, we also took our budget information and we presented it by school, by district sites. That information is actually included in the budget book, which has been posted on the district website, along with the budget at a glance document, which is a very short, nice summary of our budget. As you can see from this chart, our spending per pupil varies from approximately $14,700 to $112,000, and the three sites on the left side are really outliers. Cost for outplaced students, RISE students, and early childhood students has always been high. So this is, even though it looks very, very high, these numbers may be shocking, this is expected. The district-wide spending is $17,173. Just to compare, last year information was $16,372, and this figure will change because this is budget. What we reported last year was actual. So we will be reporting this information again to EASB in September of 2021. And when we look at the district's buildings minus the outliers, you can see that students per magnet schools continue to be the highest spend per pupil. Approximately 18,600 for Bessie Road, which is the district's smaller school, only 286 students, but very high low income percentage, 52%. And then King Arts is the second at 18,537. Oakton School continues to be, as expected, continues to be the highest elementary school. It has the highest percentage of low income student at 57%, also very high percentage of English language learners and special education students. And it is a house of special programs. Our African Curriculum Center programming is housed at Oakton. Shute School, it continues to be our highest per pupil spent for middle schools. Last year, the spend, if you compare with last year, was a little bit higher, and it's because the student population at that school actually increased quite a bit. This year is 672. Last year it was in the low 600s. So as the student population increases, the denominator increases, which means the certain fixed costs, or they're called actually centralized costs, like the cost of principal, cost of superintendent office, business office, all these fixed costs are divided by a bigger number of students. So as a result, per student cost, for any for this location, because again, there is more students, goes down. So that's why you see that's really the biggest difference from last year, the placement of Schuth School in terms of the spending. But this is pretty much what we were expecting. We are spending more. The variance in spending is expected, and it's because we are spending more on our students who are either special education, English learners, or they are low income. So this is absolutely expected. And again, these numbers will change slightly, but they should, and they will guide our discussion about our budget reduction, which we'll be having very soon. And that's what we had.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I think it's also fair to say, and correct me if I'm wrong, that the site-based budgeting isn't as simple when you think about budget efficiencies, because you don't move the students from one school to the next, right? So we can look at it that way. It can inform our alignment to our equity work, but it may not be as clean to look at from an outside eye necessarily.
Mm-hmm. A good thing, one good thing about the report, because this information is presented in the school report card, is that these numbers do have small, there are notes there indicating whether changes in population and why the numbers are higher or lower. So that information should be available to anyone who accesses this information from the state website.
Thank you. So our first goal for the meeting today is to try to define the target. And Dr. Horton and Raphael, you both alluded to a target that we need to hit over the next couple of years. When we talk about the the structural deficit, when we talk about the amount of reductions that we're talking about, over the years in our projection documents, we've seen the gap between our expenditures and our revenues has gone from, savings of a little bit more than $250,000 in 2017-18 to now we've got a deficit this year, last year, of a little bit more than $9 million between the two. And so obviously that is spending that was expected to be overrun, which is in part the ask of the referendum for the community. The referendum dollars are supporting that gap right now. And what we're trying to do is correct that gap before the referendum dollars are exhausted, so that we're not in a position where we need to ask the community for more money. Is that a correct definition, Raphael?
Yes, it is. So the goal is to have the referendum reserve to give us a cushion, if you will, in case of things that we don't plan for, right? If we start planning right now to start reducing our expenditures, then that referendum reserve will serve as a cushion in case something happened that we have not planned. For example, this year has been a particularly challenging year. We've spent money on things that we didn't plan for. We don't know there will be more years like this. And that's the reason why an organization such as ours have a reserve. So what we want to do, we want to preserve as much as of the referendum reserve for as long as possible, just to make sure that if there are things that comes up that we don't anticipate, we're in a good shape. We don't have to resort to trying to borrow money at a high rate of interest, and we don't put ourselves in a position where we're in a financially precarious position.
Okay, and I misspoke. The $9 million gap is what we're projecting to see in the 24-25 year.
That's correct. I suspected that's what you were saying. So in about 3 years, we're looking at being able to reduce expenditure by about $10 million.
Okay, thank you. And I want to say at the outset here, I have worked in this district my first year, where I was served with a RIF notice in March. So when I see a slide that has a RIF mentioned, I understand what that feels like, and it's going to feel a little bit today in our future conversations like this board, and for people who watch this meeting as in isolation, like we're talking out of both sides of our mouths. And we have to do this diligently. We have to do this openly and honestly, and we can't waste a whole lot of time reminding people that we care about our kids' experiences. We need to make sure that we're focused on the business side of the organization here, so that we can continue to have experiences offered beyond the 24-25 school year. Otherwise, we're in a completely different situation than we are today. Is it fair then to say that the gap we're looking at, if it's $9 million as a gap in fiscal year 24-25, that what we're trying to do is figure out in the next 2 to 3 years how to reduce or make efficient by about $10 million the organization?
Yes, that's the goal.
That's a large number. I want to make sure that we're all clear on that. Do we have, Raphael, any visuals that we can show to show maybe a projection sheet so that people can see in this meeting how we get to that $10 million number?
We don't have anything pre-developed.
Well, how about the projection sheet that we kind of see ad nauseum in other meetings?
I don't, I'm sorry,
We don't
I don't have
anything
it
prepared to
on,
share.
yeah. But I just want to point out that, because we've been talking about these projections that are already old.
Yeah.
And they were developed, even the projections that were developed with this budget, some of that information has already changed. We will be bringing updated projections in February, and the numbers will probably look worse because pandemic is affecting everything. I mean, there is obviously a huge impact on the economy, on the interest that the banks are paying. Just to remind everyone, last year the district was earning about 2.5% on its reserves. Right now, it's basically nothing. I mean, we have some long-term investments that we managed to lock our investments, but the original assumptions that we used for the budget which was 50% adjustment, that is not enough. We have to take it down even more, probably to 80%. So I just want to say that this number will change, but it's going to be probably in the neighborhood of 9 million, but we don't have the exact number. What we can do, we can definitely estimate even before the release of the updated projections, something that would help us to estimate that number, but the numbers will change.
So that's what this board needs information on. We need to know what the number is that we're being asked to plan for and decide on, because this cabinet, this administrative team needs to know the parameters, because nobody, and even for our staff, I don't want to be put in a position as a board member where I'm approving recommendations to reduce programs or staff by a certain amount, only to 2 months later be offered a job back. Again, I'll state I was that staff member. I had already had another job at that point. So Dr. Horton used the term right size in his opening. We don't want to be doing downsizing and upsizing. We want to try to right size it best we can. That means we need a best estimate. We get that the numbers are projections. But if we can have on the finance team end the best projections possible, then I think we can go to our program team and do the due diligence to have the conversations, to have the best staffing and programming conversations we can.
We will. Just to kind of restate that the projections that were developed, that was presented to the board during the budget development period, assumes CPI of 1.5%. Now the analysis in the out years, for the years that we don't know what CPIs are. Now the analysis that we've been doing is showing that 1.5% was actually based on everything that has happened since the pandemic. It's actually more generous than what it's looking like in the out years. So that will be closer to 1.3%. So then that means the largest source of the district's revenue, which will be property tax, then the percentage projected will be lower. Instead of 1.5, be 1.3. So we'll revise that to reflect the most current news that we have, and we'll bring that back to the board to show what the differences are.
Okay, so my question before was, is $10 million about the number we're talking about? And if it's 10 million plus or minus, 6 or 8%, that's fine, but we're still talking about 8 figures here. It's real numbers. It's impossible to do that without talking about every aspect of the organization. And so I want to make sure that we have an ability to not only talk about the clear number, but at some point, we're going to ask Melissa's help in communicating with people a visual of what the clear number is so that it's understood. Because I want John, who's on this call with us, to say, I don't like the number, I don't like the changes, but I understand them.
So easily is $10 million. But the tricky part, and I'll be very honest, is that with the pandemic going on right now, no one knows what the long-term impact will be for the economy. There are talks about a V-shaped recovery. There are talks about a K recovery, whereby the recovery goes up and down. We're going to do the best we can based on the information that we have right now. But it's a very good possibility, depending on the trajectory of the pandemic and its impact on the economy, what that would do. So we would do what we have right now based on the best information we have. But it's always a possibility that the condition may be more challenged than what we are now. So, but we'll bring the best forward.
Okay.
And I think that's really important to highlight and worth noting again, because I know in the past, the board and administration have been criticized as, trying to make things worse than they seem to be. And then all of a sudden, finding money in places. I think it's really important for our entire community to understand that these are just projections. And this is just, sort of the best thinking that we have right now. We are facing, certainly in my time on the board, and I'm sure for most of us, in our time in being involved in any of these kinds of issues, this is the most unpredictable period that we've been in. And so, the number we give, if we're lucky, it's not going to be as dire, but I think that's probably unlikely. But in any case, we are just doing the best we can with the information we have at hand.
I mean, the business of trying to project interest rate, everyone knows very perilous. There are billion-dollar businesses out there of people trying to project where interest rate is. If folks can do it well, they're billionaires. So it's interest rate is something that is very dynamic and is hard to predict. But we depend on that interest rate for a lot of things. We depend on it for the interest that we earn on our reserve. We depend on it for the largest source of the district's revenue, CPI interest. So it's important when we make the projection. It's not a game. And what we know about projection, the further out you are from the year that you're making the projection, the more difficult it is to know how accurate that is. And especially you put a pandemic in, something that hasn't happened in over 100 years, it makes it that much more challenging. So to Sonia's point, I just want everyone to understand that we're going to do the very best with the information that we have to provide as accurate a projection as we can based on the information that we have. But it's a very good chance that will change, especially in the out years.
Understood. Are there any questions from any board members or cabinet members around the number that we're talking about and anything we need to know around it? John.
So I appreciate, Joey, you saying earlier about, how RIF notices impact people, because I do know when I started in the district, there were, I know people that were RIFed every year when they were untenured, and they were asked back every year. But it was usually a period of months, and that was a very stressful situation. So as a DEC member and as a DEC rep, I appreciate the planning and foresight that is going into this to take this seriously as we move forward. I know one question that was asked of DEC was like why we're not willing to dip into reserves. And I kind of know the answer to that, but just to kind of get it on the statement, and particularly about if we were to just blindly go forward and not make any cuts, when our reserves would be depleted.
I think we know that answer would be this year, John. It would have been this year. The projections, and that's so the document that I'm asking Raphael and Kathy to share. It's been a part of public packets before, and that's why I think we should go through again, re-educating people on how to read it, because it's kind of it's a messy chart, but it has.
I actually have it, so I can share it if that's helpful.
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay.
Thank you, Kathy.
Oops, I'm so sorry.
And if I'm correct, the consequence of us dipping into our reserves too deeply puts us in an unfavorable position for borrowing.
It's actually more than that. It's catastrophic. I hate to be so direct and be so colorful in my language, because it's like a savings account. It's like an individual who lives day to day without any savings account. There are things that happen in life that we all, even with our best intentions, that we cannot predict. When those things happen and you have no savings, you're in a bad shape. We have a community that depends on the school district. We have an employee that depends on us being able to ensure that when they provide the services they provide, by teaching our children, by serving our children, they will expect to get paid. I know there have been cases in Illinois where school districts have no reserve. What happened then is the district is taken over by the state. Then those districts have resort to borrowing money at interest rate that is untenable. So good financial discipline, good financial thought requires you to have at least minimally 25% of your daily operating expenses in reserves. I mean, it'd be just absolutely irresponsible to run a school district, an organization, $135 million enterprise without having a reserve for eventualities. So I cannot even continent running this organization without having at least a 25% reserve.
I think it's also
25% of daily operating or 25% of annual operating?
Annual operating expenses. You want to have 25% of that in reserve. That's minimally what is required.
I think it's also worth noting that, this idea that, we just dip into it for a few years to get us through this. When we don't really, knowing that we still have the structural deficit in place. So it's not like we would have any plan or ability to put the money back into the reserve fund if we dipped into it. So that's kind of another consideration, is that we would not only, it's not like it's a temporary thing that then we just fill it back up after the crisis is passed.
So
We'd be continuing to dip into it year over year.
Additionally, we are bondholders. We have outstanding bonds. Bondholders who bought those bonds based on the financial rating that we have by the major rating agency. And so the interest rate we paid was based on the assumption about where we are financially. Now, if that financial position changes considerably, one of those requirements is that we have a certain amount of reserve. Then when time comes, which we just did last year, when we had an opportunity to refinance those money owed, just doing that over 10 years, we were able to save close to $2 million. That opportunity would not be there. We will have to actually borrow at what is junk bond status to be able to do any refunding. So it'll be a perilous thing to be thinking about to run an organization this size without minimally having 25% in reserve.
So this is, sorry, go ahead, Sula.
I just had a question about how this is the structural deficit is represented. I think it might be helpful to show the rate of expenditure increase over time, and then the lower rate of revenue that we take in, right? Because that's the issue, is that these two lines are diverging, right? We are our expenses are outstripping our revenue, and that gap is growing. So I think if we had kind of a percentage rate of expenditure growth versus the percentage rate of revenue, and that I understand is very unpredictable now with the pandemic. But I think that might be helpful for me too, to wrap my mind around how
we actually have it. We actually have it, and it's included with our detailed projections, because this is only for the power presentation purpose. So it's, room is limited here on the slide, but the projections that are included in a budget book have exactly the information that you describing and that you need, which is the rate of growth for both revenues and expenditures.
And then I think we need to then talk about how much do we need to bring down the rate of expenditure, right? To have it closer to revenue, our projected and expected revenues. So that would be helpful too, is how much of a decrease in percentage of expenditure growth do we need? So
the one critical thing that causes the structural deficit is that in any given year, 80% of our revenue is tied to CPI in any given year. And over the last 10 years, as I've done an analysis of what the average rate of CPI is, we're looking at about 1.7%. But at the same time, if we look at the average rate of expenditure, it's been higher than that. So out of the gate, every year when we start the fiscal year out, our revenue source, 80% of it, is lower than our expenditure source. So that's why it's important when we talk in terms of expenditure, why we have to benchmark those expenditures to CPI. Anything more than that, the imbalance only grows. So that's our benchmark.
That's helpful too. Thank you.
And real quick, just to kind of answer my own question from earlier, if I'm reading this correctly, the bottom line would show that in the school year 2024-25, so in 4 years, if we didn't do anything, our reserves would be depleted. Correct? That's what I'm reading here, just to kind of give it to the right.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes. And I would like to point out one thing in relation to these reserves. In order to use our reserves, we have to run deficit budgets. So we have to have an unbalanced budget, which is already not what the law is requiring us to do, because by law, we have to have a balanced budget. Every time we would pass unbalanced budget, and that happened in the district, I believe in 2002, the state now will require us to submit a long-term plan. And as Rafael mentioned earlier, they can take over if they feel that our reserves are not big enough, then they can step in with their own recommendations. So anytime you would like to use $1, we have to have an unbalanced budget in order to dip into those reserves.
So the question that's being asked, if we look at this chart that you're showing, Kathy, that middle blue bar that says revenues minus expenditures, you can see the green vertical line, is this year. Mm-hmm. And we've got $144,000 plus that we can set aside. But if you go just 2 years down to 22-23, there's a $3.4 million gap there that gets covered by the referendum dollars just below it, in the gray line just below. And you can see how much money we have from the referendum dollars on the very bottom. So today we have $30 million in referendum reserves that are saved to cover these out years, those 4 years that are in the red on the right-hand side of that middle blue bar. And every year, that first year, there's $3.4 million that are covered. There's 6.6 million the second year, 9.5 million the third year, and then 12.4 million that final year, all being covered by referendum dollars, with that last year there, 25-26, still not being completely covered. And so to Sula's question about, to see the gap, it would be nice to see it as more simplistically with a graphed line so we can see the diverging lines here. But those numbers tell that story as well.
And the analogy that I want to use, and I would say it very bluntly, it's like you're driving a car, you have a train coming at you, and you're saying, we're just going to keep driving until we meet. Now, if you're in a car and you have a train coming at you, the train is going to get the best of you. So I think the best thing we need to do, which is what we are talking about right now, is planning to see how we can get off the track and we can keep going the right direction instead of waiting for that freight train to come at us. So I think it's imperative that we know what is going to happen if we don't do anything in 3 to 4 years, that we start doing something today to prevent us from having a situation where we have no reserve for any eventuality that may happen, which we know is going to happen. It's a matter of what and how much of it is going to happen to us. So I think it's prudent for us to start planning to make sure at least we have 25% in reserves in case something happens, to be able to weather it, to continue to provide an excellent education to our children and our community.
Thank you. Board members, are there any questions about this chart that Kathy's sharing with us right now that anybody has? That as it
I have a question.
Anya, go ahead. Thank you.
So I feel like we are not talking about the comprehensive number that's represented on this chart. We talked about approximately $10 million that needed to be reduced, but what I'm seeing is 20 if we're talking about preventing the amount of revenue or the amount of excessive spending or expenditures that's projected as of 24-25. That is a $20 million dip into our reserves, according to the cumulative balance of referendum reserve line. Am I correct in that?
The cumulative balance is obviously what's left, but and with the bottom gray line, that's what's used to cover the actual gap.
That's annual though, right? And so it's cumulative of 3.4 million in 22-23, 6.6 million in 23-24, plus the 9.5 million in 24-25.
Well, we wouldn't have to cut twice. I think if we reduce in 1 year, then these expenditures will not be in the following year. So, all next year's will look better, basically, if we just remove them once, because they will not carry into the future years.
So what you all are saying is that if we made $10 million in reduction to our expenditures over the course of now to 2024, that we would then not be dipping into our reserves
And
balance our budget.
And those changes would likely have a cumulative effect that would at least negate some of the $12 million gap that you see in 25-26. Maybe not all of it, but right now we're trying to limit the expenditure increases that have been happening year over year by reducing. And you can see in the 24-25, those top two lines there, it's a $10 million difference.
So I feel like we as a board need more specifics. Those are definitely, these are big numbers. And so, speaking in generality certainly gives us a context of the size of the problem that we need to resolve. But as you were referencing earlier, Joey, I feel like we as a board need more specific context of the problem and the potential target for resolution. And I feel like our community is going to need more specific explanation as we bring this conversation to board cafes or present I can't remember what the proposed process, the thought inquiry, what was the name of that?
The thought exchange.
The thought exchange. As the thought exchange is presented, I think, folks can't be imaginative about information that they don't have. So I think we'll need some more specifics.
Thank you, Anya. Are there any other questions? So do we, Kathy, maybe do you mind stop sharing?
Yes, of course.
Thank you. So do we have a general agreement that right now it's a soft $10 million number, and it sounds like the clarification that we're asking for as a board is for probably in some kind of quick turnaround, try to define if that number is going to change at all, to what degree it's going to change, so that we understand why it's changing, how it's changing, and can speak to it and understand it as well. Is that clear in terms of what we're looking for on the admin side?
Yes, it is. It's clear on our end.
Okay, thank you. John, you got a question before we move on to number 2?
Yes, please. So as we look at that kind of general $10 million number, are we looking at that this year, or are we looking at that over a period of, and I know that's a difficult question to answer now.
We're talking, yeah, we're going to talk about it. And I think probably we're going to ask to look at it in a few different ways so that the board can choose between a few different options, but I think we're going to talk about that in a little bit.
Thank you.
Suni?
I just wanted to raise one other clarification, because I think that's a good point, that we're not necessarily talking about cutting $10 million this year, that it's over a period of a few years, although it's still not a pleasant number to be talking about in any case. But I think it's also worth clarifying and highlighting a point that Raphael made, that, we will be making, having this discussion and figuring out kind of how these cuts, painful cuts, are going to look. It still doesn't necessarily, and it will improve our situation for a period of years, but there is still an underlying structural deficit problem that I think will be highlighted by the graph that I know we've seen in the past that Sula was mentioning. That, at some point we do have to figure out how we can make sure that our expenditures are better tied to CPI, so that we do not, because otherwise we might be solving a problem now, but it's going to get punted down. Maybe it'll be years, none of us will be on the board necessarily when it gets punted down to it, but it is just punting the problem continually when we're not talking about what is causing the structural deficit.
Sure, that's a good point.
So I just want, Joey, I think you said we were going to get to this later, but in the case that I wasn't explicit about what I was hoping to see, I'm hoping to see a chart or graphic representation of the amount of reduction in expenditures that we need to make, the amount of time that we have to make it over in order to prevent deficit spending and in order to maintain our reserves.
That's what I understood you to be asking. Admin, are we good?
That was our understanding too.
Awesome. I just want to make, as we go through it, it might seem a little robotic. I'm going to pause and make sure that we have agreement so that we don't walk away with misunderstandings, because we want to be respectful to all of our staff as we go through this decision-making process, and make sure that when we leave the meeting and the work gets done, that we're not duplicating things because we misunderstand each other. We're going to pause. We just did some numbers. We're going to pause and talk about process, and then we're going to come back to numbers again. So goal number 2 for this meeting is to talk about the process. What does the process look like for this? I'm going to recap what was in the slides. there's going to be a couple ways that we're looking for community outreach and to include the community in this process. And different stakeholders are going to have different ways to chime in. And I'm going to repeat some of the things that were on the slide, and the slide will be posted so people can look at it. Because Thought Exchange is one way. The Thought Exchange is going to be open in December. That is going to be a digital space where any member of our community, whether you have children in the schools or not, whether you're a staff member or not, whether you're maybe a high school student, you're able to log into Thought Exchange and respond to a prompt that will be in the prompt. People can share their ideas in Thought Exchange. People can read other people's ideas and rate them. People can respond to people's ideas. And through the collective thought of the community, there will be a process that will rise up ideas that are most supported and some of the best, and everything will be there. So you'll get to see the breadth and the diversity of ideas that are shared within Thought Exchange. It will be there for a finite amount of time because we can't have it there forever. But it is going to be a place for people to share ideas, to rate ideas, to comment on ideas, and it will be something that will be there before winter break, and we're going to ask people to share ideas there. A question for, I don't know if it's maybe for Melissa, is Thought Exchange able to do a parallel exchange in Spanish? Do we know?
Yeah, it will support multiple languages. It is through Google Translate, but it will allow people to submit ideas and pose their thoughts in various languages, and also interpret the other thoughts that are provided.
Awesome, thank you. That is an explicit way. You know, some people like to come and share comments at board meetings, and then they're disappointed when board members don't respond to them. That's a one-way commenting mechanism. Email is another way. We want people to go to Thought Exchange and share their ideas there. So please, if you like to post things on Facebook, the board members aren't necessarily reading Facebook. We're going to read Thought Exchange. So that's where we want comments to go. We're going to read those themes, those motifs. We're going to want to see it. The board cafes are going to happen in January, and pairs of board members are going to host basically a Zoom webinar to anybody that wants to come can come and talk about the budget process, ask questions. It is a deliberate space for parents and community members to advocate. So please look at the dates and come to some of those. And hopefully we'll be able to do some board cafes in Spanish as well.
Just to clarify for folks who are always Zooming, Zoom webinars don't allow for interaction, but Zoom meetings do. And so these would be Zoom meetings that allow for us to see one another and hear from one another.
Awesome. Thank you for clarifying, Anya. But we want people to come to those board cafes. We're going to vary them in time of day and day of week so that people can have some flexibility. And as a board, we have to decide at some point the dates and whether we want to each, host 1, 2, whatever we want to do there. Out of respect to all of our staff and the different stakeholder groups within the staffs that we have, there's going to be community input opportunities in January as well. These are going to be forums to ask questions. They're going to be in group orientation for each union, but also there will be leadership dialogue. It's a deliberate space for staff members to come and advocate and to ask questions and understand this process. Again, coming to board meetings and sharing statements are wonderful, always welcome, but you don't always get a response. There's going to be specific spaces for staff to come and share ideas and thoughts. We want to leave no stone unturned. So if you've got a good idea, we do want to hear it. And these staff dialogue opportunities are going to be a place for that. And then there will be a community survey going out either in late January or early February, which is going to be redundancy of asking different people for different ideas. So there's lots of different ways we're going to be asking people to share their input. And please, if you have an opinion on this matter, those are the places to go. And we want to encourage everybody to do that. That was my community engagement infomercial. Anybody want to add anything to the community engagement piece?
I have a question.
Go for it.
Will we have a dedicated webpage for these resources that we can refer folks to?
Yeah, we sent out last week or the week before the update following the last finance committee meeting, where we sent the message from Dr. Horton along with some resources in terms of the video that was available, and also a fact sheet. It was 10 financial facts based on the district's financial outlook. I would encourage everybody to review that because there was a really nice line in there about structural deficit and the percentages in which expenses were outpacing revenues. So I think that that's really helpful. But yeah, Anya, to answer your question specifically, under the quick links on our webpage, we will aggregate all of the resources under there in terms of videos from previous meetings, any presentations, financial documentation, as well as engagement opportunities. So how to access the thought exchange, the schedule for the cafes once they're available, the survey, et cetera. So we can have one central point to drive people to. So absolutely.
Great, thank you so much.
I just want to take a second to really urge people to participate in this process, that when we think about this issue, it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of how. And on the back end of the decisions, we won't be able to make the adjustments that you care about, but we absolutely can make our decisions based on what we're hearing from the community and what people are valuing. And so I know we offer input often and we don't always get as much input as we would like, but this is a really critical issue to every family that will be felt in some way by your family. And so I really just encourage people to participate and as our educators to participate in these opportunities so that we can really hear from our community, because there will be choices. There will be choices in how we make these cuts, and it's really important that we can have as informed a position as possible, and that that time for that process is now, not 6 months from now or a year from now after these decisions are made.
Thank you, Biz.
I have I guess a request and an inquiry about the Thought Exchange platform. Just as we applied the racial equity impact assessment tool to our superintendent leadership profile process, and that wasn't necessarily a tool that was originally designed to have the racial equity impact assessment tool applied to it. I'm wondering if Thought Exchange has the flexibility to do so. And so that we don't, the way we have done in our community historically, disproportionately elevate the voices of the most powerful or the most well-resourced, and artificially minimize the voices of the most marginalized. So is there any method of collecting demographic data that would be useful for us to disaggregate the opinions of the most marginalized in our community?
I don't know, Dr. Horton, if you've used Thought Exchange or if you've seen it.
I met with them to go over their product. I haven't used them before, Joe.
I've used it, and there definitely is a capability, Anya, that you're looking for. I think we might want to engage with them and see if they can either record or maybe even come and share for 10-15 minutes a little bit about what it is and how it is, or maybe they can help with the how-to video to get people to engage. But there is a way to do, Anya, what you're looking for to a degree, and give us an ability to put an equity lens on this conversation.
And I can speak a little bit more to that. So the nice thing about Thought Exchange is that you don't have to have any sort of like a login or username. You don't have to create an account. It's an open-ended exchange. When we create our question, we can also create and add a few demographic questions that are going to be really important to us to make sure that we are getting those diverse voices at the table. We want to be mindful of how many questions we're asking so that it is a fairly streamlined process, but we can certainly ask people to identify if they're a parent or a staff member. They can identify by race. They can identify potentially by what school their children attend. So a few questions like that will help in the analyzing of our data. So that definitely is possible. And those questions are at our discretion. So we do have some flexibility to determine what those might be.
Wonderful. I feel like we did get have a useful system with the superintendent leadership profile. So perhaps to save on some cognitive capital, we can just replicate some of the systems and strategies and that we used previously with the thought exchange survey. I think, we certainly, just to clarify, not necessarily for everyone on this webinar, but for our community, we would not want to have a thought exchange survey and be excited to have 1,000 participants, and those 1,000 participants be only from 2 schools. And that would be representative of maybe, a certain voice, a certain perspective in our community, but not roundly and broadly a District 65 perspective, or it would not necessarily represent the most vulnerable individuals in our community. And I think, if we're going to ask to hear from our community and use that feedback, part of the focus on stakeholder feedback is because of the racial equity impact assessment tool, and that tools ask for stakeholder input is for the stakeholder input from marginalized folks, not necessarily any and all stakeholder input in order to produce equity. If we don't want to unintentionally replicate systematic harm, then we need to hear from the communities that have historically been harmed about how to stop harming them. And so that is the reason why we are specifically talking about how to disaggregate this data, to notice if we are hearing a trend of feedback from historically marginalized populations, that we listen to that with empathy and with a lens of harm reduction.
Absolutely. Thank you, Anya, for raising that.
I can just add really quickly too that I do think that we'll take a multifaceted approach to getting this out. So not just sending it via email, but we also have the ability to send the thought exchange question out in English and Spanish via text to families. We know that we get really good response rates to text messaging. So that's something that we're looking to employ, as well as Anya, you had mentioned the feedback and focus group that we had done related to the superintendent search process and some of the suggestions for how we can get this information out there, as well as partnering with some of our family groups and community organizations to ensure that there's awareness just related to this whole conversation, but also participation in the thought exchange cafes, et cetera. So definitely, yes.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
Any questions about the multiple mechanisms for community involvement or feedback and communication through this process that's been shared? Obviously, we have to dot a couple I's with dates for board cafes and things like that, but is there anything that anybody feels like we need to do more of, or does it feel like it's just right in terms of our expectations as a board and trying to do the outreach?
Just to, Seth, you just want to weigh in real quick, and in regards to just really understanding the budget process, it can be like a budget 101, right? For folks who may not have the background, right? Just to make sure that people really understand that and make it as clear and as in parentese as possible, right? Because I think we tend to use a lot of terminology that is inaccessible to the community at large, right? And just echoing what's been said earlier is that the more accessible we can make the information around what the budget involves, why we're in a structural deficit, what does that mean? That I think is it's very something worth repeating and worth really exploring to make sure that it is very crystal clear to all members in our community and that it's accessible in regards to what the budget process is, what some of the terminology is that we use often, and to make sure that people understand the process at a very basic level.
Thank you, Sergio. And I think it goes without saying in terms of the administrative request here is if principals are sending out newsletters, it would be nice if something was written for them that they can push out. But the more we can do to encourage staff to participate in the areas that we're asking staff to participate, to get community involvement, to partner with our older people so that our non-parents can be involved in the process as well. Anything and everything that can be utilized would be very helpful in this tight time frame. Biz?
I'm not sure exactly how folks will be classified within the structure of the process. I'm assuming they'll be connected with their school that they attend, but I'm wondering if it is helpful for us to have neighborhood award information as well, because I do think that if we saw themes presented by folks that are not given the opportunity to go to a neighborhood school, that would be important for us to evaluate as well. And so I'm not sure what selection process we need to have in terms of how we collect data, but I think that that would be an additional layer for us exploring marginalized populations and making sure that we're putting equity at the center of our decision making.
And Melissa, if I'm not mistaken, we do have the demographics. We'll have a little bit of control of what we can ask for, right? I know we have data by ward. I just got a report today from Karen with Northwestern. We can potentially do that for sure.
Yeah, we did the superintendent leadership profile survey, ward, race, ethnicity, language, I think ability, perhaps gender identity and sexual orientation were also demographic data that we asked for.
Yeah, we can look back to that and also work with the thought exchange team and also with Kylie and our RAD department in terms of what makes sense for the demographic information at the front end of the thought exchange, but also for the survey later on in January.
Thank you.
Are we able to work with the city of Evanston to recruit their help in sending this out to all residents?
Yeah, we definitely can reach out. I'd be happy to reach out to my contact there. I know that they have supported us on occasion when there is a topic that really makes sense to include to a wide variety of residents, but I do know that they are cautious as to what they agree to, the same way that we are with outside organizations in terms of the information that they share. You know, the city probably gets a lot of requests from, again, organizations across the city looking for support and communicating. So I will definitely tap into that and see if we can get something out either via one of the city newsletters or also working with our aldermen. I know that they send out regular newsletters to their various wards. So maybe we can, as we create that toolkit and share that information with our principals to share with families. Also empowering community partners who are willing and able to support through their communication channels as well as internal too. So all of our leaders as well in reaching staff. So I do think we're going to have to put that information together and make it as easy as possible for those organizations to support our efforts.
Thank you. Suni?
I certainly hope the city will not look at us as just another organization asking for help in disseminating this information, that, you know, this is really about getting taxpayer input and that we're all serving the same taxpayer community. And so it's important that they help us. You know, we can get to parents, but we know that a large part of our community who pays taxes do not have children in our schools, and we need their input on this as well. So hopefully that's how the city will view it, and all of our city council members. I also wanted to just clarify, when we do the cafes, and I know that we are going to do outreach to staff members, to community members, to parents, but I hope we're not making I'm going to advocate at least that we don't make the cafes specific to any particular group or particular school community. I think it's important that we all have the conversations together and that we're all hearing from each other and not having siloed discussions.
Agreed. I think the only way that it might be, well, we have to talk about the translation options so that we're not having cafes where only our biliterate board members are talking to our Spanish speaking community, but that we're able to all experience that as well. All right, so with no further questions on process and communication, we'll close up with the process section with just February 9th Finance Committee meeting and the board meeting that month. February is really the month where we're going to be hoping to look at the review of all the community input, the surveys, the thought exchange, the in-person cafes and things like that, or virtual cafes, and look at the themes, the motifs that have come up before we have to look at the considerations for reductions and efficiencies that will be presented in the March meeting. And then in March is where the timeline is where we need to vote on certain things so that the appropriate process can be followed should there be a reduction in force of any kind. Our final goal for today is to have some time for the board to have kind of an ideation session, a throw it at the wall and see what sticks conversation around the budget. We've all had time approving bills and having some questions, but this is where we're going to start to throw some ideas out there. And for the admin, I think one of the goals is to listen. Don't be compelled to answer the questions. I want you to hear openly and transparently some questions that we, the board, have about the budget so that you can think about what makes the most sense in your day-to-day work with our staff and executing our programs on behalf of students before we need a recommendation from you. And I'm happy to, if somebody doesn't have some things that they want to start with, I certainly came with a list of ideas. I'm happy to start with and model sharing a few of my queries to give everybody else some time to think about some stuff, unless somebody wants to jump in here. This is where it gets super fun. All right. One of the things that we've talked about previously was staggered start school times, staggered start times for schools. It's a big decision. It implicates communities in terms of shifting the time frame. But the idea was that possibly we could save money in our transportation budget by utilizing the same buses for repeated routes within a school community, as opposed to having all of our schools start at the same time. Therefore, we can't share bus routes. So my question is, what do we need to know whether that's feasible? How do we find out about how much of a savings that would be to know whether it's worth it? And how much time do we need to execute it? Because if you were to tell me we could save $1.5 million in our transportation budget by just staggering the elementary and middle school start times, my question would be, can we do it by next fall? Right? And so the question is, can we get this done? What do we need to get done? And that's certainly something that's on my mind, because it's not impacting classrooms. It's not a staffing conversation per se. We might need less buses, but that's kind of the goal. Does everybody understand that example that I just threw out there? It's a real example. It's a real question that I have, and I'm hoping we can find a way we have to communicate with our transportation company to ask them, if we were to do something like this, what would our benefit be, so that we can answer that question.
And Joey, I would rather us not answer the questions here. I think we spend time collecting the questions that the board members are asking, and then we can get together and respond collectively.
That's why I'm hoping that this is a transparent opportunity for our community to also hear some of that question.
So Joey, I wanted to kind of piggyback on what you're saying. And so then, given that right now, we're all in remotes, and as we think about the transition back to in-person instruction, right, which is our ultimate goal, I really think, we have a starting point here. Everybody's at home, right? We're not really using the bus company. So, what does the road back look like? And would that conversation, right, or that question be answered as we plan maybe perhaps hybrid up into eventual all-person or in-person instruction, right? And I'm wondering if the answer may lie in our return to school planning as a district in regards to how we re-engage with the transportation company and what the cost savings look like as we gradually resume some of these services, for instance, our lunch services and our nutrition services, resume. So all of that, what does the road back to in person, which is our ultimate goal, look like, and what are the cost savings that we have now, right? And what we've heard as a board is, again, it kind of cancel out. Again, we've been doing most of our work remotely, and there's been some cost savings, but at the same time, there's, it kind of cancels out because there's still some new expenditures, for instance, around PPP, around cleaning our buildings and making them ready for in-person instruction, right? So I think that's so it's a really good question, number one, but number two, how can that question get answered as we transition back into in-person instruction? So just putting an angle on that there.
I have a question.
Anya, sorry, I was muted.
That's all right. So I am curious to receive information because we've gotten financial information previously about life safety expenses and needs that our buildings have, which are extensive. I think there's like $100 million of life safety investments that need to be made in our buildings and infrastructure. I'm curious what the lifespan of each of our buildings is so that we can be clear on return on investment into those maintenance upkeep decisions that need to be made.
Thank you, Anya.
I'd like to see that data.
Thank you. Liz?
I think piggybacking on your earlier points, Joey, and Anya's, I'm curious about what are the program alignment and school location alignment that we're looking at making big cuts in the short term, but long-term projections about what that alignment would look like in terms of reductions of busing over a 10-year period, what that alignment would look like, if we're putting in a fifth ward school or if we're closing a building that doesn't have a very high lifespan, like what are all those things juxtaposed to each other? Because I think we have a lot of expenses that feel very pressing right now, but maybe some of these decisions, the better decision will be an investment in the short term that yields reductions in the very long term. So I would like to know what some of those big program alignment and districting dollars would mean in our decision making.
Thank you, Biz. I want to piggyback on yours because it's a building facilities one. We spend about almost $300,000 a year, $283,000 a year on the rental for our students who attend Rice. Again, not looking to move some of our most vulnerable students, but curious to know, how long we've been paying that bill and what kind of a facility could we own by that point, so that we're not paying more than $250,000 a year in perpetuity. If there's a more financially feasible option for supporting that program and housing that program.
And there had been mention of efficiencies in the presentation, and just getting a sense of, well, I guess we have to have a sense of like, what is efficient, how are you defining efficiencies, but how efficient are the programs that we're currently running in the different buildings, and how we might better assess efficiency would be helpful.
I'm going to add something that's maybe unpopular for the conversation that we're having, but I also want us to not be throwing good money after bad. And so I would like to hear from our cabinet members if they would say, we're only 80% funding this thing and it could actually work so much. It could have such greater impacts if we actually funded it 100%, right? And so it's not just in cuts, but like, what is the smarter way for us to be spending money to have the greatest amount of impact, particularly when we're thinking about our opportunity to achieve gap and other huge structural pieces. Us spending millions of dollars that isn't getting it done, you know, maybe reshifting how we're spending that money or increasing investments in certain areas would be a better long-term investment.
So I feel like we could all preface this isn't going to be a popular topic of conversation. I mean, everything we're talking about is painful, and we're talking about real changes that I think none of us want to make, but we understand that for our financial health, we have to consider. So with that, nobody wants to talk about class size increases, but I think we have to consider that. And so I think it would be helpful to know, practically speaking, what is even possible. I know we do have a lot of old buildings, and so I don't know how close we are to already maximizing, and obviously class size changes. I don't know how long we have to be in social distancing guidelines. So I guess, having some sort of context for being able to talk about where we can even go with class sizes and what kind of impact that would have on related staffing cuts that we could potentially do. I think also talking about, and again, this is purely for discussion, and I'm not suggesting that these are groups that don't have value or that I think that this is where we should be making any cuts, but it would be helpful to know. So for example, when I came on the board, we had an influx of some dollars that could be used. And so that's when we started putting APs in elementary schools. I know that they have significant value, but I'm wondering if we can, talk about in dollars, like how much are we spending on APs? And is that something is that a group that we should be considering if there are reductions there? Same thing with like instructional coaches and some other staff groups. I know that they have value, but I think we need to understand, kind of going along with program efficiency, and understanding that, I think we need to know how much we spend and what kind of return we're getting on that, and if that's someplace that that it makes sense to think about reductions.
Thank you. And I think to add to that conversation, not just class size, but class size by grade band, right? Our priorities, like maybe not in K2, but what does it look like in 3-5, and obviously put some value on where it makes most sense to not just a universal ask, but to really look at where it makes the most sense if we had to do it. Sergio?
So going back to mention around, collaborative work with the city and with the university, exploring, some of the cost efficiencies that can be created, or again, that currently are occurring, right? Re-exploring those in collaboration with the different institutions in Evanston and beyond, and maybe looking at philanthropic money as well and then some of the partners that we partner with for after school programming, right, that provide these enrichments for our kiddos after school, and particularly for our most marginalized, right? So how can we have cost savings there? Again, for me, education is a community effort, right? It shouldn't just sit as the sole responsibility of District 65, but we need to be working in collaboration with ETHS, with the City of Evanston, and the philanthropic partners and other community organizing partners that are out there. Because again, as we got to move together as a community to ensure that there's great outcomes for all Evanstonians and all Evanstonian families and kiddos. So as we have these budget conversations, right? Again, we're all dependent on one another. We're all kind of digging into that same tax pool, but what efficiencies can we create? And I know people out there have talked about, well, why don't you consolidate the high school and the elementary school district? And there was some research done maybe 5 or 6 years ago at the state level that showed that actually combining and consolidating school districts isn't that efficient, but there is efficiencies in, for instance, like some of the virtual services or expenditures that school districts may incur, right? And so again, looking at those different ways that we can find, in collaboration, find efficiencies that'll benefit us budget-wise.
Thank you, Sergio. I'd like to add, in our board packet, and it was back in August, we had about $660,000 in labeled consultant services. So obviously looking at what it is that we need to go outside the system for to support, and whether it makes sense to continue doing so. That's a big number. $27,000 were listed under sub answering service. I think that was back when we had somebody answering a phone call for people calling in sick. I'm hoping that's an ASOP subscription right now, but I'd like clarity on whether we're paying someone to answer a phone call when people are sick still, even though they're just supposed to go online and enter their absence. I hope we're not paying someone for the answering service. I think there were legal services. We had $100,000 specifically line item to negotiations. We had another $608,000 for general legal services. That's over $700,000. The question of whether or not there is a more efficient way for us to get our legal services as a district is a question that I have. I feel like if we had our own lawyer, if we had our own 2 lawyers, it would be less than that. So that's a question I'd like to explore. There's different models for legal services for a district. So I want to throw that out there.
I would also love for us to get some more information on the outplaced students. I feel like that has become just an increasing every year. It is increasing part of our budget. And when we just looked today at by site expenditure, I mean, obviously it's fewer students, but it's still, we're spending an enormous amount on outplacing students. And, I just wonder if there's a way to keep those students in-house, to maybe utilize park differently or better so that we can bring some of those students back to the district. And I know we've kind of had those conversations, but I think it's worth kind of talking again if there's a way to reduce that cost.
Just to connect Sergio's talk about partners and Joey's about consultants, I would love for us to examine whether we're fully leveraging our partnership with Northwestern. We have a wealth of talent in this town, and they should be wanting to work with us in a multitude of ways. And I'm not sure we're taking advantage of every avenue for that. So kind of reassessing where those partnerships are and where else we could utilize them.
Thank you, Biz.
We did announce community grants recently focused on equity, and those might be worth looking into if we have programs or initiatives that would qualify.
That fund is still pretty small at only 500,000. So I think it's worth a continued conversation, but I think just to, I think all our contracts need to be reviewed, and whether or not we continue with services that we're currently paying for, I think is really important. I know it's not, it's some of the things that I'm going to mention are probably not very popular, but they're worth visiting, and that's the automation of certain processes that we have, such as payroll and billing. Of course, it's always nice to have someone to talk to, but we do have to make those difficult decisions. So automation is an option. There's also, the commitment that we have under CARP. So currently, all of our kids have devices. Everything is done through computers. PDFs and documents are on computers, of course. Where developmentally appropriate, we still would need pens and papers and things of that nature. But, you know, for our middle schoolers, you know, we probably spend a whole lot of money on paper and equipment, and how can we cut down on those expenses? And ultimately the use of our spaces, the use of our actual facilities that we have. You know, the idea that we can now do remote, that we have a little bit of flexibility around how often our kids are in the buildings. Could there be a day that we don't use our buildings, or that we rent out our buildings? You know, a couple years back, we talked about contracting our facilities and renting out. We never really set a goal for how much money we wanted to bring in for those type of contracts and potential partnerships. So you know, how can we bring in more revenue into our school district? And I think that the idea of the staggered school start days it's a great idea. Not only would it be a reduction in the amount of buses that we have in our city, it does have an environmental impact on our community. And I think that's also something that with a lot of these decisions, I hope that we take into account wherever possible, how we can be moving towards a more sustainable school district. And you know, back to Sergio's point, you know, we found really creative ways to bring in community partners. So when we're thinking about gym and, you know, the ability for our students to participate in a league, whether it's a sports league or you know, or a music, you know, a band and orchestra and all those things, you know, how do we maybe grant access to our buildings to our partners and really change the dynamics of what our buildings look like in terms of activities for our students. So those are just a couple ideas that I had, and then the final one that I know that you will hear from our community most certainly is that we are very administrative top heavy. And so while it's, you know, we have a wonderful cabinet, we have wonderful professionals, it is one of our highest expenses. And again, we're called to make difficult decisions. And I think, you know, most organizations are looking to cut from where their biggest expenses come from. So rather than nitpicking and finding you know, smaller amounts of savings, I would implore you to find where we can get bigger cost savings.
Thank you, Rebecca. Anya.
Yeah, so one thought that's come to mind is a little indirect, but when we're talking about our broader goal of ensuring that we're closing the gaps in opportunity to achieve, the joint literacy goal with the high school comes to mind. I feel like that we had just gotten the report of what that the progress on that goal, how that would be reported to us the last time we met. I feel like having an idea of the results of that data is important consideration for this decision making. And I think these decisions need to be framed up before the next joint meeting, but I'm presuming that this is the time at which that data would be getting collected and compiled. And I think if there are any compelling conclusions or things that are revealed from that data being compiled, that would be important to share as part of this process, because that joint literacy goal is meant to give us a long view, a longitudinal perspective on gaps and opportunities to achieve. And if we can take a backward look at student data and see if there are places where places or programs or opportunities that seem to better situate children and families to close the gap in opportunity to achieve, then those are places that we want to invest. If there are opportunities that do not seem to have an impact on the long view in terms of closing the gap in opportunity to achieve, then perhaps those are programs and places that we want to expend less. But I would like to hear from Cabinet about what you perceive in your purview is essential work for us to close the gap in opportunity to achieve and ensure high quality and rigorous education for all of our children. And I would like to hear data that supports shorter periods of time and longer if possible. So that occurred to me as we were talking as something that's important.
Thank you, Anya.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I had two other notes. One of them was also, yes, let's think about what are the other leveraged resources and partnerships that we have throughout the community, as was mentioned, in our work with Northwestern, as well as the many nonprofit partners and foundation partners, et cetera. There's a lot of resources and capital that we could leverage to address some of these gaps that may be created. And I think as we're talking about reductions, hearing about the potential indirect consequences of those reductions is important as well. So not just talking directly about the program, but what's indirectly related to program changes. That's what I had written down as we were talking.
Good point. Thank you. I have a couple other questions on my list here. Outdoor education, $110,000 spent on that. Certainly would love to see a halt to Camp Timberley as a program for a number of years until we find a less expensive alternative. I don't think we're going this year, but would like to solidify a plan around outdoor education. I see professional growth and development listed at $45,000, and then principal professional growth and development listed at $45,000. And I'm assuming, since one is titled principal and the other one is not, that maybe we have professional growth and development budget for teachers that's the same size as the administrators. And I don't know, I feel like greatly outnumbered group of people, maybe those could be looked at. There's also a training and workshops budget of $556,000. And I'm curious to know if these are substitute costs for like group PD, or if that's something else. I'd like to understand the cost of that $500,000. We have a $75,000 credit card fee line item, and it sounds like that might be something that isn't necessarily paid, but I'd like to understand why it's in our budget as a line item and why we're paying credit card fees. As it relates to our contractual obligations with extra duties and stipends, which are $750,000, I'd like to understand the internal controls that we have to ensure that we're only paying the necessary duties and stipends, that this isn't something that is just loosely being done everywhere, that they're actually, as it relates to the stipends, that these are value add co-curricular opportunities often, and extra duties are typically tied to supervision and things that need to be done. So curious to know about the internal controls on that. I also saw a car allowance for $5,780, and I feel like we discussed in recent years eliminating the car allowance. And this is different than the itinerant staff travel mileage line. And it's a small number, but still a number. I also had temporary help at $13,000. And I'm wondering, when we need temporary help, if maybe we just stretch out our process a little bit longer so that we don't need the temporary help. We just need a little bit more time to complete the task so that we don't need the $13,000. I think that was related to maybe the switching over of the SIS and the business management software this year, but I still have a question about it. I have a question about, sorry, anybody else have questions? I was going off my list, but I gotta like look at it and not see you.
Got a long list there, Joey. I got a quick one. I just want to make sure that even though it's a small part of our overall budget, you know, really making sure that we're leveraging the dollars that we're receiving from state and federal grants that fund, or for instance, our title grants, so all title grants, Title I, Title III, and just some of the state grants around, you know, early childhood, preschool for all. If there's opportunities to, I know we're going to go into a budget year, and the governor's already asking for, you know, budget cuts, or he's kind of talking about that, but really kind of just making sure that whatever dollars we have, that we really are leveraging them and maximizing them, right? Because even though it's a little piece, and actually for me, the Preschool for All grant, which I used to administer, is, again, we know early childhood is so critical, and that grant really focuses on our most marginalized kids and giving them a head start, along with their Head Start federal funding, which we've gotten great reviews on, and from National Head Start when they've overseen our program and reviewed it. So again, just making sure that we're maximizing the current state and federal grants that we have and not losing any at all. Because I think we've experienced that in the past, where there was some funding at the state level that we missed out on, and just making sure that we're keeping an eye on all our federal and state grants and maximizing and leveraging them.
Thank you, Sergio. Biz?
And this may be an addition, but we need a comprehensive translation strategy, and hopefully with some intentional investments that can in the long term be cost saving. But I do want us to make sure that that's part of our math as we're doing things, because that is not an area we can cut, and we need to probably invest further in.
That's a problem with this board. We're talking about budget deficit reduction, and we're adding services. Thank you, Biz.
But I'll underscore that, and I got to say that again, a well-informed parent is a parent that can advocate for, or a caretaker that can advocate for their kiddos, right? And I think, you know, given that we have such a diverse community, it's an equity issue. And, you know, how great would it be, right? Because we have folks who are, you know, Haitian, who speak, you know, patois. I mean, we've got it all here. And there are services out there. I'm at the state level. I'm going to try to see in my day job if we can try to maybe get some contractual. You know, again, we have a bidders list. We have to. There's a certain amount of folks that give us a certain rate. So my push. I'll work at the top level, but again, to kind of help provide something in cost savings for school districts. That's something that's I'm working on in the meantime. But overall, I really think, again, it's just so important to make sure that we can present information like these budget hearings, right? Making them accessible to as many people as possible, so that they feel vested in the process, and that we really do truly care about the kiddos as well, and their input.
And this also,
I guess I would remind us too that we do have some local resources for that. You know, we do have a whole team, about 8 parents that we put through a translation program. You know, that the cost of stipends to parents would probably be a whole lot less than going to a language service provider, and to do it in a more equitable way where we could maybe assign some of them to schools. And so I think too, whenever possible, finding local sourcing for any of these services, especially post pandemic. I think that we have a certain responsibility to ensure that these dollars are staying within our community. As we talk about contracts, as we talk about anything that we outsource, I would put that at the very top of our list, is ensuring that whenever possible, we keep dollars here in our community.
Absolutely.
I think that's a really great point. And I also just wanted to highlight, this is an issue where we really need to work with our governmental partners and Northwestern University. I know we have tried in the past on this issue, not to no avail really, but I think it's worth pushing because, again, we are all serving the same community. This is not just an issue that District 65 has. It's something that all of these other entities have. And so let's work on it and find a solution together.
We're at the 5:50 mark. This meeting will not go past 6 o'clock. So since I've said that and it's being recorded and publicized, it will be so. I have a couple more things on my list, but if anybody else has some things on their list.
I just have just one thing I forgot to mention, if I may just add, the collaborations that we pay for in the city, and I've mentioned this at several other board meetings, even before Dr. Horton, the investment that we make into Cradle to Career, unless we know what our return on investment is over a span of 5 years, $50,000 from each school district, without having a clear return on our investment, I think that needs to be revisited.
Thank you. Sula?
Yeah, just as the new member who's still learning about how all this works, I would appreciate, looking at the budget, the instructional costs are the biggest piece of the pie and obviously the most important. And just understanding how we can communicate and collaborate with our bargaining units and how we get their input on where they see possibilities for efficiencies and reductions, I think would be important and valuable.
Thank you. I had a question. My dog has a question too. It's probably it lands in Stacy's corner. It's about instructional coaching and kind of the K-12 developmental continuum. So 219's got a pretty good model where they actually, I think they fund department chairs, but also some coaches for their feeder schools. I like that model. I worked over there for a little bit. I'd be curious to know if 202's investment in our joint literacy goal goes as far as helping support funding some of those positions from a pre-K through 12 continuum. It would be a really nice investment as a partner in long-term learning. But any other model like that, I think this is the time to look at it. Similarly for everybody else, as it relates to learning, I know that some of our buildings cost more to maintain and keep open because they're just old, and they always leak. I think about the kindergartners at Orrington, who I don't know how many times a year we get the email that they're being vacated from the basement. If we had people had an option next school year, after all of this that we've gone through, if we had a full school's worth of children who were interested in continuing learning remotely or in a virtual setting with a virtual staff, and we actually could operationally shut down a building as a result of that, to be able to have that conversation without and talk about the building without having to do some of the other maneuvers is a really interesting proposition that maybe we wouldn't have thought of a year ago. We don't have extra space to move people around, but construction costs are high, maintenance costs are high, but I think it would be interesting to consider other learning models We have overcrowding at some of our middle schools. We hear about it all the time. And maybe we have an opportunity to build our own virtual school in some way that can benefit us both in terms of our opportunities for students and options for families, but also economically. So that's something that I'm definitely open to hearing more about or seeing if it exists. I'm also I'm interested in understanding, you look at neighboring districts. We partner with District 202 for food service. And so as a result, we don't put into an RFP things that you might put if you were looking for a private company, like an Organic Life or one of Arbor, one of the other many providers that are out there. When you do an RFP for a broader company that's not your neighborhood high school, you're not just looking for the food, but oftentimes you're looking at staff. And I wonder if there's an economic benefit for streamlining and outsourcing some of those jobs. I know some of those companies will also hire our local community that are already doing those jobs, but I think it's something that we have to look at. And I wonder if there's any other roles that makes sense for as well.
Joey, your comments made me think of another note that was I had, which is the cost of busing children out of the 5th ward versus the cost of schooling children in the 5th ward. And if we could have that calculation if there is expenditure savings there. We know that it would tremendously impact quality of life and experiences that folks are having, but if we could pair that also with reductions in expenditure, then that would be good to know. Yeah, that's it.
That was a lot. Are there any clarifying, like global clarifying questions on the admin side for that are general, not specific to an item necessarily, that anyone has? I think Dr. Horton, it probably makes sense as your team consumes and thinks about the laundry list that was just kind of laid out there. If there's specific questions and you know who asked the question today, you guys know how to reach us. Feel free to email or ask if you're not understanding what the question was, 3 days from now. I think there's certainly plenty of ways to clarify those questions. I appreciate my board colleagues for sharing some of these ideas out in the open, right? And it's a public forum. People can hear this, and people aren't going to like hearing any of the ideas. I don't think any of us enjoyed having to think about this. It's a leadership opportunity. We have to make these decisions for the children. And if we don't do it now, it only gets worse. So I appreciate everybody coming to the table today. I appreciate the leadership team for coming and listening, and John for representing DEC as our partner in education, being here. Again, this is not a fun conversation, but this is step one, and it leads us into 2 months of what I hope is, what we all hope is really good communication and dialogue with our community around these topics, so that people can stew on this a little bit and can give us their opinions and their advice and their dreams about what they want for education in this community. And that will get us to a new year where we'll talk about how we get there.
Thank you for
Thanks,
that.
Joey, as your committee, for your leadership of the committee.
Thanks, everybody. Without further ado, I will adjourn this meeting 2 minutes earlier than expected at 5:58 p.m.